All right, I want to thank you for joining me today. I'm going to be doing these twice a month going forward. This is the plan, the second and fourth Wednesday of the month, 12:30. The format is going to be, I'm going to have a lead topic that I'm going to talk about. I'll go through this, and then I'll open it up for any questions that you have. I know I got one question in advance that I'll be addressing too. All right? So the question I'm going to look at today is which retirement account options are best for you. So when it comes to retirement accounts, we have different ways that we can fund them. We can fund them with pre-tax dollars, and that's things like 401ks, IRAs. We can fund them with after, and that would be like a Roth IRA or a Roth 401k. The conventional way that we can put money away for retirement is a taxable brokerage account. And then one that's often overlooked is a health savings account. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about each of these. So the first is pre-tax contributions. That's like your 401k, your IRA. The advantage of those is that when you put money into the account, you don't pay tax on that money. When what you put into the account grows, you don't pay taxes on any gains if you exchange securities. Current income also isn't taxed, but you do pay taxes when you withdraw funds from the accounts. And then something to keep in mind too, for all these different types, and I'll talk about the differences for each one, is how is that money taxed if there's money left in the account to your beneficiaries. So in the IRA account, you have an inherited IRA, excuse me, and that has a 10-year period under current law, which it has to be withdrawn. If it was before this year, you had your life expectancy. Now it's 10 years, and that unless it passes to a spouse, and then it's the same as for a regular IRA. But the general rule is if you pass it to a non-spouse, that you're going to have 10 years to bring that in. That can make a really big difference because while you don't have to take the money each year, it can change their tax bracket. So it's definitely something to think about. The second way that we can put money is after-tax contributions. So that's the Roth IRAs. You pay tax on the money that goes into the account. You don't pay any taxes on money, on any gains or current income that that account generates. You also don't pay tax when you withdraw the funds. It's actually something, if you have children, to think about. Like I've talked about it with my kids. If you have a job and you're earning some money, and you're not paying a very high tax rate, you can get benefits from putting money into a Roth today, and then it will grow for your whole life, and you'll never pay tax on it unless they change. There are some exceptions that allow you to access at least a portion of money, and that would be due to things like buy a home or education costs. And then the other thing to remember with the Roth is that while it does have to be pulled out if it goes to your beneficiaries, it's not taxable to them either. That's another reason to consider the Roth when you look at what the future may hold. The old standby, I call it, that's your taxable brokerage account. And you pay tax on the money that goes into the account. You pay tax on current income. You pay taxes on a sale. And you know that's taxed to your beneficiaries at withdrawal. I'm sorry, but I take that back. The big benefit from a tax perspective of a regular brokerage account. So I remember when I was in college and I had a professor that I took a tax class from, and he always used to say that the tax law, it loves the dead and hates married people. And the reason that he would say that was because when you pass away, if you have assets that are sharply appreciated, your beneficiary gets a stepped up basis to the fair market value. For example, I have a client who owns shares of Apple that date back to 3 days after Apple became a public company. Those shares have a cost basis of about 56 cents a share. Today, Apple trades at about $380 a share. So if those shares were sold while the original owner is still alive, basically the whole thing is a capital gain. But if you wait to do something with them until after that person has passed, then you get a step up to fair market value, and you won't really have you won't have that big tax burden that would come with selling the shares. And then the fourth way is the way you get a triple tax benefit, and that's a health savings account. Reason it's a triple tax benefit is you don't pay tax on your contributions. You don't pay any taxes on the account's gains or current income if you've invested it. You don't pay taxes on withdrawals as a general rule. The rule being that as long as the money that's withdrawn from the account is used to cover qualified medical expenses, then you can withdraw it tax-free. And it's important to note that those qualified medical expenses do not have to be incurred in the year that you withdrew the money. For example, if you open up an account today and you put the money into the HSA and you invested it, in 10 years from today, you had a major surgery or something like that and you need the money, well, you can get the money from 10 years ago. But the other thing is, if you had $2,000 of expenses this year, as long as you keep your records, in 10 years, you could withdraw that $2,000 and still not pay any tax on it because it's qualified medical expenses during the time that the account is in existence. And then the one thing you do have to remember, a little bit different on this one, it's tax to beneficiaries. When there's money left in that account, if you pass, then your beneficiaries are going to pay tax on the amounts as they pull them out. So you should think about, if you have an HSA, think about it as an account to fund your retirement healthcare expenses, but you want to use that, place a priority on using that first, because you don't really want to leave money in the account if you can help it. Other things to think about, most of us, our employers do not offer us Roth IRAs, Roth 401ks, things like that. Think about doing things like a Roth conversion or a backdoor Roth IRA. A Roth conversion is where you take money that's in your 401k or your IRA and you convert it into a Roth IRA. You do pay tax on it, but it can still save you money. And I'll show you an example in the next slide. A backdoor Roth, if you've kind of maxed out on your employee retirement plan at work and your income is too high to put money into an IRA, you can make a non-deductible IRA contribution and then shortly thereafter convert that to a Roth. And if your accounts are set up the right way, that would be something that you don't pay tax on. And the thing to keep in mind is, with the Secure Act that passed at the end of last year, Roth conversions are probably more valuable than they used to be because of the fact that we now have this shortened time frame that I mentioned earlier, over which you can withdraw funds from your account. A beneficiary has less time to withdraw money, so they can get hit with kind of like what they call a tax bomb. Think about if there's $1 million in an IRA when you passed, and if you gave it to somebody, that's $100,000 a year if they just took the money out with no gains on an equal basis, and that can really change their tax bracket. Other reason to think about Roth is that when we're married and both spouses are alive, you're paying tax, you're filing a tax return, married filing joint. If one spouse passes, you suddenly convert to a single tax return, and filing single can make a big difference in terms of what your costs, in terms of how much tax you're going to pay. So doing that Roth conversion is a way to help lower those taxes. You also have to be careful though, because you want to make sure that Medicare doesn't cause a problem either, because when your income's above a certain level, you have to make an IRMA adjustment, which can make your Social Security benefit go down. So you have to make sure that you consider all those different things. And here's what I'm talking about with the tax rates. Sorry about that. My mouse is a little bit too sensitive right now. So if you look here, at the end of 2017, we had the Trump tax cuts. And we went from the tax brackets that you see on the right to the ones you see on the left. But those changes sunset at the end of 2025. If there's no other change to tax legislation between now and then, in 2026, rates are going to go up. And think about this, like if we look here, if you are a married couple and your income on your joint tax return was $200,000, you'll see in 2020, that puts you in the 24% tax bracket. In 2026, if we go back to the 2017 rates, that'll put you in the 28% bracket. And if your income was $250,000, while you'll be in the 24% tax bracket, in 2020, when you get out to 2026, your tax bracket could be 33%. That's a 9% increase. So by paying that tax today, you'll pay significantly less tax. And at $250,000 or even $200,000 for a single person, you can see that that rate is also 33%. But definitely something to think about is doing Roth conversions proactively if you can. It's also important to make sure that you have diversified, just like we talk about diversifying your assets, we want to diversify our account types. And so it's good to have a mixture of all these different types of accounts that I've talked about, because that gives you the most flexibility in terms of setting up a good withdrawal strategy when you reach retirement. So then that's it for that part of the discussion. I did get a question about asking me if I like dividend paying equities and then to compare them to municipal bonds. So there's a couple things to consider in trying to answer that question. First is how much tax you pay. If you have municipal bonds, if they're in your state, you're not going to pay federal or state tax. You may pay some state tax if they're not in your state. But the difference is, I think back, I remember one of the first books that I read by Peter Lynch. He gave an example. He said, one of the reasons that he doesn't like bonds, and you have to be careful with bonds, and I know that we talk about them as a diversifier too, is think about this. If I buy a bond, I buy it today, and it's worth, it's got a maturity value of $1,000, and let's say it pays a 4% interest rate. So I'm going to get $40 a year of income. Say it was a 10-year bond. I'm going to get $40 of income from that bond for 10 years. So I'm going to get $400 of income. And at the end of 10 years, I'm going to get my $1,000 back. On the other hand, if I took that same $1,000 and I invested it in a stock, and let's say that stock at the time that I did it was only yielding 3%. So that 3% yield, that's $30 a year. But now let's say that dividend grows at 7% a year for that 10%, for that 10-year period. In essence, that dividend should just about double over that time. And so that means that we started out with a $30 dividend. Now we have a $60 dividend. And hopefully, if we've invested wisely, our investment's worth more than $1,000 at the end of that period. If the dividend yield of that stock had started at 3%, if it stays at 3% when the dividend doubled, then the stock price would have doubled. So that one of the disadvantages of bonds there is that we don't get any growth. Diversification matters because stocks and bonds don't move together. We do pay taxes on the dividends. We won't pay taxes on the earnings that we get from municipal bonds, but it's so important to remember that that's a reduced tax rate that we're going to pay on the dividends. It's the same as the capital gains rate. And we don't want to let, then I said, which tail wags the dog, right? There's an old saying that I remember, don't let the tax tail wag your investment dog. So you want to be careful about letting taxes be the sole determinant of your decision. When I'm talking about all these different types of accounts and talking about the importance of taxes in your decision-making process, don't let that be the driver of your decisions. So it doesn't mean that any one of these investments isn't a good thing, but if I have a choice, I would prefer to have more weight in my portfolio towards stocks, and how you own them also matters. If you own your stocks in mutual funds, one of the things that can happen is you can have a mutual fund that you have an interest in. During the course of the year, that mutual fund goes down in value, but the fund managers sold stocks and they have to distribute the gains that they have from those stocks. Even though the fund might have gone down in value, you still might get gains. And that's really not a great scenario. So you have to be careful about that. That's why I prefer, if I'm investing in a taxable portfolio, to use ETFs. Some people can use individual securities too, because it gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of managing that tax rate. I had unmuted everybody. I had muted everybody. So I'm going to go ahead. And if you have any questions for me, that's kind of the prepared part of my presentation. So if anybody has any questions, you're welcome to unmute and go ahead and ask your questions. Susan, I see you're trying to talk, but you're muted.
It's the lower left-hand corner. She can unmute herself.
Yeah. let's see, hold on, I'm gonna try it.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now, yes.
Okay. If I have an IRA, a rollover IRA, I also have a Roth IRA. If I want to move it, can I move the stocks in it, or do I have to sell all the securities in order to do it? Or can I just, move it over as it is and pay the tax on it?
So you should be able to transfer the securities income.
Right.
And
That's what I wanted to see
value-
if I can do that.
The value for tax, it's still taxable when you do that. And
Right.
it will be valued at the time that you transfer them. So in other words, if you have 100 shares of Apple,
Yeah.
I'm going to transfer 100 shares of Apple from my IRA to my Roth. The
Right.
shares of Apple, like I said, they're worth around $380. So that would be a $38,000 Roth conversion. You would pay tax on that, and then the shares would move over.
So I have to pay tax on it, even though it's now in a rollover IRA where I don't pay tax on any of the trades.
Well, because I thought your question was you're converting it from a.
In other words, I have securities in a Roth IRA and a rollover IRA.
Right.
And if I want to move one into the other, I have to sell them in order to do that.
You don't necessarily. So if you have a security in your rollover IRA and you want to move it to your Roth, you can transfer it from the rollover to the Roth, but
Right.
it's a taxable transaction. So in other words, even though selling it, you pay tax based upon the value of the security at the time of the transfers.
Okay. That's discouraging. Okay.
Now I had do you ever hear about CHY, Calamos Securities?
Yes.
Okay. Now that's not a bond. That's a high interest fund. So let's just say what drives me insane is I'm not complaining about making money, but when your income jumps up 125,000 and it's dividends, you got to pay taxes on it, but the cost basis is dropped down. So if I was to cash out of it, it would be a loss. You know what I mean? It's down. Say we'll call it 10%, and I'm paying for the dividend roll coming in. And I was just trying to figure a way of finding something more where I wouldn't have to have all this extra income. In other words, I got to stroke checks at the end of the year for the dividends. And
So are those dividends or those capital gain distributions that you're getting from the fund at the end of the year?
They're dividends.
Because usually the issue that happens is that I own a mutual fund and the stock market had a bad year. And so the value of my fund went down. So maybe it started the year at 50 and it ends the year at 40. But during the course of the year, the fund managers sold some securities in the account. And when they did that, they have capital gains and they have to distribute those to the shareholders. So technically when they're capital gain distributions.
Right. But mine were definitely all dividends. It wasn't just that one. It was a bunch of the ETFs that were paying dividends. So I'm just trying to, I guess I was sort of thinking, is that a trading style? I mean, do you like to have a lot of dividend income, or when you set up a portfolio, or?
I generally do, because I look at it two ways. One, if we have especially if you're in so there's two different stages that we have as investors, right? There's accumulation, which is why we're working and we're adding money to our accounts. Dividends are probably a little bit less relevant then. But then when we retire and we get into the decumulation stage where we're starting to spend what we've put away, I like to have dividends because they help to keep me from having to sell securities to raise the money that I need to live on. And so that's one part. And so typically when I have a retirement portfolio, the yield on my average portfolio right now for a retiree is probably about 2.5% or something on that, in that order, because then those dividends help to meet their cash needs so that they don't have to sell securities to raise capital.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I guess that's one way of looking at it. Yeah, really, because you're only pay. In other words, if you got 75,000, you're probably going to have to just take 25,000 of that and pay the taxes. What you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's the more positive way of looking at it.
It's actually like when I think about allocating the portfolio and what their cash needs are, I like to have a certain amount that's readily available, subject to as much market fluctuation. And I count the dividend income that portfolio is earning as part of it, used to meet the current needs. And so that means that I know I don't have to sell as much because I'm going to let the portfolio generate some of that cash on its own.
I gotcha. I guess another way, if you got a 2.5 or 3% dividend, and technically if you're down 10, you're really only down 7, right?
Yep. Yeah, I always think of like with individual stocks. Sometimes if I buy an individual stock that I really like and it's a strong company, and it pays a nice dividend, I think about it, I'm getting paid to wait, right? So if I buy the stock today and it doesn't go up in price, and maybe it even goes down in price, but if I'm a long-term holder, meanwhile, I'm still getting paid. So if paid to wait while I wait for the story that I believe will lead that stock to do better to play out.
And one more question. What's your minimum amount to open an account with you?
So it's about $100,000.
Okay, cool. Okay, Susan, you can go ahead.
To me, Detroit, no?
Anybody else have any? If there's any other questions from anybody, please feel free.
Hey, Phil, this is George Randolph. We talked about 6 months ago.
Yes. How are you, George?
I am great. I wanted to know when it comes to investing after retirement. I think when I talked, I was supposed to retire this month. I decided to stay on.
Huh?
But do I need to become more conservative in the investments? What I've figured it is, if my cost of living over the years is going to be about 3%, and I want to live off interest, that means I'm going to have to bring in an interest rate of somewhere around 7 or 8 in order to live off of interest. Is that possible?
7 or 8% yield in this environment would not be very easy to achieve because interest rates are so low. You know, conventional thinking, if you get back to the first part of what you said, George, the conventional thought has always been that as we get older, we should get more conservative, right? Because we don't want as much fluctuation, and we have worries that if the market goes down, we don't want to. Two of the worst things we can do as investors are buy high and sell low, right? So we talk about getting more conservative as we age, but I'll tell you that I've read a lot of research that talks about the idea that as we approach retirement and get into the early part of retirement, we should become more conservative. But then as we start to move away from retirement, because of the fact that people are living longer and longer today, we want to then think about building our position in stocks back up a little bit by selling our bonds to meet some of our needs and getting a little bit less conservative as we age, because we're worried about what we call longevity risk, right? Which is the possibility that we outlive our money.
Right.
Did that answer your question, or do you have anything else?
It did, and I'm 56 last Monday, and I'm eligible to retire from the federal government. And just thought that in order for me to try to live off of the most of interest, because the only thing I have is a TSP and the retirement. So in order to live off of interest, I thought maybe I had to earn somewhere around 6-7%. 3% would go to cost, and then 3% might live off of. And you're right, looking around, it's hard to find those numbers, except that, with the federal retirement system and the TSP, those funds kind of indicate that the yearly income or yearly averages, it's been from 4 to 7%. And that would mean leaving it into the government funds, and I didn't know how much risk that was.
So if we look at, excuse me, if we look at the funds in the TSP, over the last 10 years, they've done really well. We saw the market fall 35% earlier this year. If something like that was to happen again, you can't expect that the funds are going to deliver the same type of returns as they did historically. To get a 6 to 7% return on a long-term basis and on a total return basis, which is looking at your dividends and your interest plus the appreciation in your funds, that's not unrealistic to think that you could get that kind of return on a long-term basis. But in a given year or a given period, you may or may not get that just because of the natural fluctuation in the market. And we had that 35% drop and we recovered from it very quickly. We haven't really seen that kind of drop followed by that kind of gain many times in the past. We had like the worst quarter in decades in the first quarter, and then we had one of the best quarters in the last 20 years in the second quarter. That kind of, those kind of periods back to back. But overall, the 6 to 7% return is not unrealistic. Or a little bit more weighted towards stocks. Like if I think about it this way, that a stock portfolio in my mind is typically get about an 8% return over a very long period if I look at history, and a bond portfolio probably about 4%.
What?
And so if you kind of took an 8% return and you had a 60-40 split, 60% stocks and 40%
Look at that.
so you get like a combined return of about 7% from that type of allocation on a long-term historical basis.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Now, have you changed like you just said 60-40? That's basically your risk allocation. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, during the COVID stuff, have you offsetted that any or?
I really didn't. I mean, before we start investing, I go through risk tolerance stuff with people to kind of figure out what kind of allocation makes sense to them. So not everybody's at 60-40. I think my lowest allocation is actually 30-70. And my highest allocation is 80-20 among the portfolios that I manage. So, and what that allocation is, it's dependent upon your risk tolerance, number one, and number two, your financial plan. Because sometimes I'll do a financial plan, I'll say, you know what? I know your risk tolerance says you can be 80-20, whatever it is, but there's not a need to do that. And we're really not trying to beat the market. We're trying to help you live the life in retirement that you want. And why take risks that could jeopardize that unnecessarily? It seems to me that it's better to just have the application that works to help you achieve your goals.
Yeah, the last guy that was talking, the 56-year-old guy, he, I'm 58. I feel where he's at, but so when I got thinking about the 401k that I got, so, everybody talks about going conservative, but shouldn't you look at that 401k like a money machine? And like he was talking about the, getting 7-8% of the, and you're saying, yeah, you can usually achieve that with a 60-40. Wouldn't you, how do you feel about like your other guys allocated 80-20? I mean, if it's a cash making machine and you're long term and you're just worried about what it spits out every year, not worried about the balance. I mean, is that a valid mindset?
It is. The people that are 80-20 are generally younger. My folks that are in their 50s to 60s, I think that most of them, that's not the 30-70 portfolio, that's for sure, right? Those folks, I think the most that I have for anybody in that time frame, that age group is probably about 70-30. I know personally I'm in that same age group. And my allocation is actually higher than that, but that's because I'm comfortable with the level of risk and, you know, with what I'm doing. So that your personal level of comfort really has a big say in that too.
Well,
Yeah.
well, I mean, I think that's the only biggest fear you'd have as far as any investor would be blowing up the account, you know,
Yes.
as a trader, you know.
Yep.
You know, like I said, it's just like ignore the balance and just focus
I
on
did
the
that every
monthly
year.
check is, I didn't know if that was a good way to look at it
You
and just
said that.
up my risk.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it depends. Like, I'll tell you, I'm not a trader, right? So I told you I'm higher than 70-30, but I'll also tell you that I have stocks that I've owned for 25 years. So I'm not moving things around. I find
I
things
would be very careful around
and
the
I'm willing to
election
hold them
time.
for a long time. You know, I'll change them if the story with the company changes and I no longer have faith and confidence in the company, I'll change the position. But beyond that, my focus is really on the long term and not doing a lot of transaction-based moves.
Gotcha. Well, thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Well, since this is an Ask Anything conference, Bill,
Sure.
when you think about people like you and versus this TSP money managers or TSP managers, there are at least 6 or 7 funds called L funds that they manage.
Mhm.
Would you be doing anything different than they would? Because right now I'm in an L 2030, which gives me about 60% in the government bond, and then, you know, I think maybe 20% in C, and then the rest in S and I and F. Would you be doing anything different than that?
So one thing, George, that I see when I look at those funds is that they don't offer as many diversification options as you might have otherwise. The TSP funds on the international side, they don't have a lot of I don't think they have very much emerging market exposure. They're in the US, you know, they have a fund is kind of equivalent to the S&P 500. They have a small cap fund. I don't know that they have as much mid cap exposure. So it's more that the universe that I would choose from is probably a little bit broader. But I will also tell you that, you know, the expenses of the TSP are also very low into that balance. And that's one of the things that helps the TSP performance, to be honest, because the expense ratios on the TSP funds are less than 10 basis points. But it would just be the two things I always talk to people about with the TSP versus having somebody manage. You get a little bit more diversification if you have somebody else manage it, and a little bit more flexibility. Like if you have money in a TSP and you're thinking about the Roth conversions that I talked about before, it's a lot harder to accomplish those. You have to kind of pull the money out to do that.
Yes, you're right, 100%. Okay, I'm still worried about retirement though.
I understand.
Well, on a lighter note, the last guy was in bonds, so he's probably done pretty good.
I'm not doing bad.
There you go.
I'll tell you that when COVID was at its worst, the bond portion of portfolios was definitely outperforming the stock portion. You know, when I looked at my portfolios, even the ones that, whether they had a 50-50 weight or 60-40 or 70-30, all of them, the bond portion grew enough that rebalancing was necessary because the bond portion was getting too big, because the bonds did outperform the stocks during that time frame.
Well, I think everybody knows where the risk tolerance is now.
That helps, right?
Oh, God, yeah.
Right. Does anybody else have any other questions today? If you don't, if anybody's interested in talking to me one-on-one, on this screen, it shows a link to my calendar. And if you're not on my distribution list, you can sign up by using the email address, the web address that I've included there. If not, I want to thank everybody for joining, and I will see you again. Hope to see you again in a couple weeks. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Bye.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Phil.
You're welcome.